Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Riskologists. I'm your host, Andy Haslam, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Scott Macaulay. Scott, welcome to Riskologists.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. So, how's your podcast game? We always ask this to everybody. And have you done anything like this before? Do you listen to any in particular?
I do listen to podcasts, but no, I've never had the pleasure of participating, so I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent, excellent. So, we usually like to start the podcast with a bit of a journey to date for you. So, a bit of a timeline of your career, where it all started, and maybe a bit of a journey of what's got you to the recording today. So, fire away.
Sure. So I've got over 20 years of senior leadership experience in high hazard environments, including submarine service and the civil nuclear industry. During this time, I've led multiple business changes and in different contexts, including turnarounds, reinvention or change of purpose, and closure missions. I've also led multiple leadership for the management of safety peer reviews, during which I take a small team into a business unit, whether that be in the UK or abroad. And we look at how the leadership practices, processes affect the safety of the organization. And we offer solutions, not just criticism, which is always good. As part of that, I've done extensive research into accidents and incidents from across the world, multiple different industries, to develop themes to help me really add value to those businesses when I conduct the peer review.
Awesome. As everyone can probably already tell from the title of the episode, today we're going to discuss risk and leadership in high hazard environments. I think, given your previous experience, which you've already just mentioned, then we can't ask for a better person to dive into this topic with. But from your perspective, are there any of the reasons why you've chose this topic in particular today?
Yeah, I think it's because a reflection on mistakes I've made in my previous careers. So when I was going through these incident reports and also the things that I've seen in other places, I realized that I'd behaved in many of the same ways,
Mm.
and I was keen to share the error of my ways and also the things that I've seen from across the different industries.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Scott, for being part of this today. So before we get stuck into the topic really in a little bit more detail, as after all, this is a risk management podcast. What and how has your experience been with risk management over your career, and what sort of relationship have you had with it?
So it's varied over time. To be honest, I didn't see much point in it in my early career, which is probably not a great thing to admit to. But it seemed quite nebulous. It seemed sort of almost disjointed from my day to day. But as I grew to understand it more, and I realized it wasn't just the by the book process; it was much broader than that. I saw much more use in it, and actually, I realized that a lot of what I was doing already was part of that risk management process, but it wasn't structured, it wasn't joined up. It was just doing it because it felt like the right thing to do. So that realization led me to invest much more of my time and effort into risk management holistically,
Mm.
as opposed to turning up with a risk practitioner once a month and discussing very high level risks that may or may not come to fruition.
Mhm. So getting into the topic, firstly, I think it's great for us to be considering risk and leadership in the same breath. I mean, I won't speak for the risk community as a whole, but I'm sure some will empathize when I say that the terms are often mutually exclusive. In your experience, have risk and leadership always gone hand in hand? Has risk often been at the forefront of leadership meetings due to the nature of the environment you work in, or does it still often make its way down the itinerary and list of priorities?
Yeah, I would say no. It hasn't always been at the forefront, and I think that partly that was by my understanding of it, and other leaders' understanding of what risk actually is, and the way that it was brought into the businesses that I've worked with. So I've seen it done very well, where it's formed the core of the safety and operations management system that's run, and it has offshoots and links to everything that is executed. But equally, as I said before, that it becomes a monthly meeting with the risk practitioner where you just go down the list and say, is this still okay? Is this not okay? And then on top of that, a plan for addressing it, as opposed to actually a meaningful action plan to mitigate the risk. So yeah, and everything in between, really.
Mhm. Um, how do you feel well executed risk management can help leadership teams then, particularly in high hazard environments? And in your experience, can it be effective in making strategic business decisions?
I think not just strategic. I think if you start at the operational level and then you move through the tactical and into strategic, it has value at multiple levels. So you won't necessarily have everything that's on your operational risk register flowing up to your strategic.
Mhm.
But if you're looking at your strategic risk register and you see that multiple business units have the same risks, does that then become a corporate issue? So
Mhm.
not only is it useful in showing you where you need to focus your attention, but it's also useful in cascading or elevating the issues and or the risk, should I say, and that will enable you to make the decisions at all three levels of the business.
Have you found that that's actually the case then with most of the businesses you've worked with? Or is that something that's just it developed over time and had to be brought in?
I think most of them it's not as well developed as I just explained. I have seen it done incredibly well,
Mhm.
where you do have that clear flow of information and line of sight. I think in my experience, where it normally starts is that if somebody wants to set up that flow, what you end up with is everything in the operational and tactical flowing up to the strategic, and they just get swamped.
Mhm.
So having that discipline to be able to say, well, okay, that doesn't sit with the strategic risk because it needs to be dealt with lower down in the organization. And equally, if something genuinely is a strategic risk and can't be resolved at the operational or tactical level, having that discipline to make sure that they're sitting at the right level within the organization is vital, I think.
Excellent. We know that risk is not always implemented as it should be for whatever reason. So, can
Mm.
you give us some examples of where you found it may not have added the intended value and what caused that and how you've managed to overcome it?
I think the main problem was that I've seen is around asking the wrong questions, and so you end up with either a very very small risk register, or you end up with something that's huge and unmanageable. And going back to what I said about the flow through your organization, that can help mitigate that issue. I think the other aspect has been even when you do have a risk register which is fit for purpose, the actions that are placed to mitigate the risks aren't always meaningful. And
Mm.
even when they have been implemented, when you look at the effectiveness of that implementation, it's it hasn't achieved the desired effect.
Mm.
And so you can take comfort for something that you assume has been put in place, get rid of the risk, it's been mitigated, that's fantastic, and then find yourself being bitten by it later on because
Mm.
actually the effectiveness of your action hasn't met the intent.
Mhm. Is there anything that you've found in best ways to try and get the better levels of mitigation out of the teams that have worked with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's about being realistic. As I said, having a plan for a plan and a promissory statement to resolve the issue at some point in the future, having the discipline to be able to say, well, actually, that isn't going to mitigate the risk. We need to be realistic about this, and not being inclined to keep knocking things off as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
We need the quality of resolution as opposed to the quantity of items knocked off.
Mhm.
And so being able to say that we haven't yet met the criteria for removing that risk, you can feel sometimes under pressure because your risk register is huge, and you can say they're all valid risks, and you want to knock the numbers down, but actually it shouldn't be a numbers game; it should be a quality game.
No, definitely very good advice, I think, for that, and something that everyone should really take away from us with that. I think. Um, I know in some of our conversations leading up to today, we touched on something you noted as the seven pillars. Could you run through what these are for our listeners? You'll obviously do a much better job at it than I can, and how they can be utilized alongside formal risk management techniques such as ISO 31000 in order to really bolster an organization's risk attitude and maturity.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing I would say is that this works for me. It may
Mhm.
not work for other people. I'll give you a bit of background of where it
Mhm.
came from. So I was running a large operating unit, and I had a meeting with one of my internal regulators, and he told me about a story about a Nimrod aircraft that was lost in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, all on board perished as a result of a fire followed by an explosion. And I'd read the summary reports previously, and if I'm honest, I didn't get much out of them. But when he spoke to me, he gave me a load of things that I hadn't seen in those summaries. So that prompted me to go away and look at the full report. A number of hundreds of pages later, I'd gone through a bit of a journey of thinking these people. So what it did was it didn't just focus on the day of the incident. What it
Mhm.
did was it focused on all of the things that led up to it over numerous years, and the leadership and management aspects that directly contributed to that incident. And so when I was reading through it, it's quite a scathing report actually, and it names people,
Wow.
which was a bit terrifying for me because I initially thought, well, yeah, how could these people make so many mistakes?
Mm,
This is ridiculous. And then it dawned on me, I've done that. And
mm,
I've done that as well. And I've
yeah,
behaved in many of the same ways that these people had behaved, these leaders
mm,
had behaved at numerous points in my career. And that terrified me really. And
mm,
so I thought, oh, what am I going to do?
yeah.
How am I going to make sure I don't end up in one of these reports? And so I decided to verify my thoughts, and I read numerous other ones: Herald of Free Enterprise, King's Cross, the big ones, um, loss of space shuttles,
Yeah.
and across the entire, numerous sectors, including nuclear.
Mhm,
And the common themes that I came out with, I distilled down into safety and security, productivity, responsible business management, people, communications, effective risk management, uh, and professionalism and rigor. And the idea behind that was to get those high level topics and then develop, as opposed to jumping straight to key performance indicators,
mhm,
I would develop under safety, for instance, I would develop what the key performance question was I wanted an answer to. So
mm,
I would look at safety and I say, well, what do I want to know about safety? Well, I want to know my people are trained correctly. I want to know that we're maintaining our equipment properly. I want to know that we've provided all of the things that we need to enable safe operation. I want to know that my management processes are supporting safe operation. I could go on.
mhm,
And each of those questions or statements that I wanted to prove would then generate an indicator. And not all of those indicators would sit at my level. They
yeah,
would cascade down into the organization. And I would then provide the oversight. So when I talk about effective risk management, that's things like, when you are making decisions, at my level or above, do you understand what the unintended consequences could be further down into the
mm,
organization? So one of the big ones from the accident investigations was cost cutting.
mm,
And so when you're in an annually funded business, if you make a cost cut at the start of the year, let's say you're going to say, I want to cut it by 10%. Well, you haven't actually looked and seen if that's possible. Is it safely possible to
mm.
continue to achieve the same level of scope for 10% less money? And what would the impact potentially be? And that's a trap that a lot of people fall into from my experience, is that 10% haircut, as they call it. And well, you'll find a way, won't you? As opposed to, I want you to go away and see what you can do, risk assess that business decision,
Mhm.
and then come back to me with what you think is achievable.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that again, Scott, with that. One thing that has kind of come up with us is and you briefly mentioned right then about KPIs and
Mm,
KPQs from your 7 pillars method with this. Risk KPIs have been considered before, but as all risks are unique in nature, it's hard to define a meaningful and generic, KRI, a key risk
mm.
indicator. Do you have any thoughts on tackling this?
I think it's a realization that a KPI isn't necessarily a key performance answer.
Mhm,
So it doesn't necessarily give you an absolute. It's more a feel. And if you
mhm,
have a suite of KPIs, because the meanings in the title, isn't it? It's an indicator of,
yeah.
not an answer to.
Mhm,
And once you settle yourself with the fact that it's not that absolute, it's much more easy to work your way around a handful, for instance, for a given risk, and say, well, okay, is it generally trending in the correct way, or does it feel, based on what we're seeing in that small suite of indicators, that we're actually trending in an adverse direction?
No, that's great, Scott. Thank you. You mentioned earlier about the realization that risk is not always by the book and wooden.
Mm,
You have the procedural or the science of it, but there is an art of interpretation. From our own experiences, though, it needs to be a bit of both data driven and experience led, which obviously helps take the art of distilling the science of it all.
mm.
Um, However, the difficulty comes with, we've found, when trying to introduce experience without a bias. Have you found this to be true? And if so, like, have you ever had to tackle the issue and how have you gone about that?
Yeah, I think the art and the science have to be mutually supporting, and I think that you can have a bias toward the process and a bias toward the experience. So I think it's you can see that from both sides.
Mm,
What I've seen is things like success-based optimism, as they call it, which, well,
mhm,
we've always done it this way before, and therefore it'll always be okay in the future, or target fixation, where you're so focused on one issue that everything else going on around you becomes, blind. You're blind to it. And so being aware that kind of trap exists both in the process side and in the experience side, I think is absolutely vital. And I think having someone in the room when you're having these conversations that can say, "Oh, hang on a second, I think we might be, drifting into groupthink here, or perhaps, your experience of this issue isn't quite as the data would tell us,
Mhm.
and just, does it feel right that the data and your experience or how you feel about an issue, do they marry up or not? I mean, one of the examples I would give is having an all green safety dashboard, and yet we're still having accidents.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
how can the two be true?
Mhm.
Either you're not measuring it correctly, you're measuring the wrong things, or there is some other form of disconnect. But you can't be green across the board and still be having near misses and incidents.
Yeah. I mean, did you have any methods then of trying to, for that particular example, having a full green screen and issues obviously still arising?
Yeah,
Was there anything in a particular way or any particular methods that you then brought in to try and reduce that or try and stop that
yeah.
being the problem?
Yeah, essentially, it was the process that I described before. So when we went through what do I want to know about safety and how am I going to know, what we found was that the questions or the indicators that we had were relevant for, let's say, process safety, but they weren't relevant for personal safety.
Mhm.
And so, what I have seen again is you'll take comfort from an indicator that doesn't answer the thing that you're taking credit for. So,
Mhm.
for instance, number of hours since the last lost time accident does not tell you that all of your vessels or pipe work and everything else are in good condition.
Yeah.
And you see it quite often where that'll be the headline at the front gate of whatever the company is.
Mhm.
And decisions will be made based upon, well, our safety must be improving. We're at 1 million person hours since the last lost time accident. Okay, but you just had a 12 mononitric acid pipe fail and drain into a bund.
Mhm.
It doesn't tell you about environmental safety either. And so it's being very clear on the questions and also what your indicators are telling you, and not allowing your indicators to lie to you, if that makes sense.
No, that's a great, again, another great answer, another great bit of advice, I think, for anybody to take away from this as well. Moving on, again, for another part of our conversations leading up to today, you touched on a couple of points that I've found really interesting. You mentioned high scoring risks where it has been deemed to be really expensive to manage, and so nothing gets done.
Yeah.
And likewise, low scoring risks that are seemingly so low impacting that, again, no management is implemented. So basically, the business do nothing to manage either. So nothing is done at all. Can you suggest why this could be? So for example, if an effective cost benefit analysis was carried out, which
Mm.
demonstrated that investment in mitigation would generate net savings across a risk's impact, why would the decision not be taken? Is there some experience you've had to that you can elaborate on in also in how you tackle this?
I think I'd sum it up with that you get what you measure. And
Mhm.
so if you're in an environment where we talk about safety as an opening to a meeting, and then say, anyway, what about those financial numbers?
Mhm.
Which do we remember?
Mhm.
Because the first one was a conversation, the next one was a demand.
Yeah.
And so I've seen that from time to time. And so it depends on the context that you're in. So if you're being driven to cut costs or to accelerate production, and you look at a high scoring risk that would take the facility or the site down for a period of time that would significantly impact on operations, or the same for financial reasons, then it can be sort of pushed to the back because we can't do it because we can't afford it, or we can't do it because we can't afford the downtime. Equally, when you look at the lower scoring risks, they don't meet the threshold because they're so low. Why would we do them?
Mm.
And so you end up with neither end of the spectrum being done, um, and that middle perhaps being done. So yeah, that's my experience of it. In terms of what you can do about it, I think it's that realization that is your decision. Back to what you said about having a bias when you're trying to make a decision. Are you biased in your decision making about that specific risk, or are you viewing it from a purely risk perspective?
Mm.
I think that's probably a way of doing it, but
Mhm.
I think if I could bottle the solution to that one, I'd be a millionaire.
No, I think, yeah, it's a very tricky one, and it's I don't, like you say, I don't think anybody's really got the answer to how that's done, but it's definitely a question which I think needs to be asked a lot more. With those high impacting risks that don't always get the time and the money I think that they deserve.
Mm.
So thanks again, Scott, for that. So just wrapping up on the subject now, again, we've spoken about ways of trying to better the art of using risk management. Do you think in particularly high hazard environments, there are any ways of breaking the usual mandrolic methods, such as everyone's sat in an office for a 2 hour risk review, and anything that can really benefit the process?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things that I found quite powerful is when you're doing your risk review in the stuffy office, as you refer to,
Mm.
getting out into the facility with the team. So taking the risk register with you and just saying, right, stand back, don't do the normal royal route, and you smell the fresh paint everywhere. No, no, go to the places that everyone knows. Everyone knows the bad bits that you don't show people. Let's go to those places and just stand back and look at what you see almost from a distance, 20, 30 feet out, and see what you can see. And it takes a little while for people to see what's there, because often they walk past it every day. But if you do that, it really opens people's eyes up, because the stuff that's on your risk register you focus on because it's a known, isn't it?
Mhm.
um, there's a lot that won't be on there potentially. And when you're out there and you can smell acids, or you can hear a steam leak, or you can hear ventilation dampers moving, or feel the vibration in the floor because of an unbalanced piece of equipment, it really gives you that sense of reality, as opposed to just looking at a piece of paper. And I
Mhm.
know the examples I've given there are potentially quite minor issues, but you also see the general condition of the facility. Are your I beams rotting through? Is the general feel of the place one of, actually, what, we really do need to invest in this, as opposed to, as I say, the pristine environment that you're in an office.
No, again, another excellent piece of advice. So thank you again for that, Scott. It kind of gets us onto towards the end of the podcast, really. And at this point, regular listeners will know that we have a question that we always put to our guests, and that is that what piece of advice would you give yourself at the start of your career that you've picked up along the way that would have really helped you at that point?
Well, I think that there are many pieces of advice I'd give to myself, but I think one of them, particularly when you're in a complex or technical environment, you can suffer from something called analysis paralysis, where you do so much problem solving and trying to refine a solution that you never actually do anything.
Mm.
And I think knowingly setting off without a plan, and I do stress knowingly setting off without a clear plan, or a complete plan, should I say, is okay, so long as you accept and acknowledge the fact that you're doing it, and you keep reminding yourself that this is not a complete plan and it is going to change, because at the end of the day, it's rare that a plan faces first contact with reality. So yeah, I think that would be what I would say to myself. Don't strive for perfection before you do anything.
Mhm.
Just recognize that it is imperfect, and that is a risk,
Mhm.
but you can then start to achieve an outcome.
Exactly. It's knowing that it's not perfect from the start, and
Mm.
working along with it. So no, again, another great bit of advice. So really that lastly just leaves us for me to thank you again for your time, both building up to the podcast and obviously for today. And I just wanted to ask if you've got, if you'd like to let the listeners know of anything kind of interesting going on at the moment with yourselves, anything you're currently working on. And if people would like to contact you about anything that we've discussed today on the podcast, how they're best to contact you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm on LinkedIn, which is the best way to contact me. I'd welcome any questions or comments, or any conversations. In terms of stuff that's going on, I've got a book which I wrote about. It's called "Leading to Disaster: How Leaders Cause Accidents." So a lot of the things that we've discussed are in there,
Mhm.
although significantly more detail. So yeah, interesting times.
Excellent. Well, yeah, everybody look out for the book, and go get those copies there. But again, thanks very much for that, Scott. And thanks for everyone for listening. We'll catch you all soon.
Thank you.